Greetings, vinyl community. Rachel, vinyl community's beloved music man, dared me to do this one, so blame her. This is a response to Rob Walker, Let the Music Play, and his arrangement of 20 face-offs, 20 matches in which we're supposed to take two artists and determine which is superior and which is found wanting. And we start off with the classic pitting the Beatles against the Rolling Stones. And of course, that's an impossible choice. They're both towering figures in music, both great, love them both myself. They haven't been doing the same thing, so it's always hard to compare in some ways. And the Beatles had this meteoric career that only lasted about 8 years, depending on how you're counting, during which they could do no wrong. Whereas the Rolling Stones have been plugging along since the 60s through to this day. They just put out a new track quite recently. And that's given them a lot of scope to falter along the way, which they've certainly done at times without detracting at all from the greatness of what they accomplished during their peak times. So looking at just the Rolling Stones and the Beatles from the time they were both existing in the marketplace, we could compare the hits, the Rolling Stones 60s hits and the Beatles 60s hits, and the Rolling Stones sure give the Beatles a run for their money this way. But if we dig a little deeper and look at the albums, the Rolling Stones really don't measure up to the same extent, because you've got a lot of albums in the early days where the Rolling Stones are just sort of marking time, doing other people's compositions. Here we have even the hits from this album, Time Is On My Side, and It's All Over Now. These are both covers, and the only Jagger and Richards songs on this album, along with two that are credited to Nanker Felge, are really forgettable. So that's a long-winded way of saying the Beatles score this one. So here's the Beatles being shown for their winning the championship in the first round. The second one, in a way, is even a more impossible choice, The Who versus the Kinks, because The Who is such a towering, iconic figure or edifice in the history of rock music that it's impossible not to select The Who. The problem is that the Kinks are so brilliant that it feels churlish not to select them. The Who and the Kinks, in a way, are two sides of the same coin. Pete Townshend, as a songwriter, is very inward-looking. Pete Townshend looks into his soul. He philosophizes about what he sees within himself, and he uses what he sees to build spiritual allegories and rock operas. And Ray Davies is outward-looking. Ray Davies looks at the world around him. He looks at his fellow man. He looks at his country. He looks at England, and he finds his soul there. The Who musically have to run away with it because they are much more experimental. They've been much more creative in a certain narrow way where creativity is equal to experimentation than the Kinks. But the Kinks have just been brilliant as songwriters, so I can't not salute the Kinks. But if I'm forced to choose, The Who is the more vital and important band. But really, it's both of them. It's a tie. It's a draw. It's cheating, but the Who win the draw. The third match is Byrds versus the Doors, two Los Angeles bands. This one's easy for me. I've never been a big fan of the Byrds. Not a great fan of their vocal sound. Certainly they've done a lot of great stuff. There's a video that I just saw recently of, I think they're at the Fillmore around the time of the Untitled album, doing the extended jammed out version of 8 Miles High. And it's stunning to watch Gene Parsons in particular. His drumming is just on fire. But for me, it's absolutely the Doors. Now there's a vocal sound I can get behind. The Doors have a lot more variety to them. I've always felt that the Byrds had a certain sameness to their sound. As I say, I've never been a great fan of the vocal sound. They do have a certain seriousness that the Doors don't have. The Doors are serious in the sense of being spooky and dramatic. But the Byrds are a bit more serious in strictly musical terms. You certainly don't have that kind of plasticky organ sound that you get with the Doors. There's something just a little bit campy about the Doors, whereas the Byrds are very earnest. Still, these are the ones who really affect me, so the Doors win that round. Next up is Peter Gabriel versus Kate Bush. And this is yet another impossible choice. Peter Gabriel as a solo artist, I do think hasn't really held my interest over the years as much as he could have. Both he and Kate have kind of small discographies for artists who've been active for so many years. But Gabriel, I think, really hooked me with his very first solo album. However, that was one of those albums where the producer, in this case Bob Ezrin, uses the artist to make his own solo album. So Peter Gabriel 1 is sort of a Bob Ezrin album, or stealth Bob Ezrin album. Certainly not the only one in the category of Bob Ezrin productions. Kate Bush is just nonpareil, but I think this is another tie. Forced to, I think I'd say Kate Bush for greater consistency, maintained interest, maybe hooked a little deeper into the heart, but that's a very narrow choice. Next up is Marvin Gaye versus Stevie Wonder. So Marvin Gaye in the 60s gave us so many great songs like Ain't That Peculiar and Heard It Through the Grapevine, and I think he really outshone Stevie Wonder in those days. Stevie really caught up in the 70s. Stevie was a very young man. He was a kid when he was putting out his early Motown hits. He was literally just a kid. So when he matured, he really matured. And I'm going to give it to Marvin Gaye for the 60s. Sorry, this is not actually a 60s album. And Stevie Wonder for the 70s. Because Stevie Wonder had his Superstitions and his Living for the Cities and his I Wish, and this album, which is basically his prog album, is most experimental. And he got very experimental, very interested in electronic music. So this is, sort of like Stevie Wonder meets Vangelis. Definitely not, hello, I'm still here. Not the stereotype of Stevie Wonder's music. Now, Stevie Wonder also went on to make some music that I really loathed in the 80s, so we will draw the curtain over that part. What's next? Next is Echo and the Bunnymen versus U2. I don't even have much of an opinion because I've never even listened to an entire Echo and the Bunnymen album. I thought I had a record to show. I thought I at least had a single. I really like their song The Cutter. I don't have it. Maybe I have it on a various artists compilation somewhere. That's why I don't have the single. U2 would have to get it for just for the Unforgettable Fire alone. That's a really great album. I'm not a big U2 fan, but that is a really fine record. Echo and the Bunnymen, The Cutter, that took me years. As big a Clockwork Orange fan as I am, an Anthony Burgess fan. It didn't even occur to me that chorus, which seems to be saying, spare us the cutters, save us from some doom, some cutting, some stabbing, some danger. It's actually in the movie of A Clockwork Orange. It's right there. Can you spare a bit of cutter? Where cutter is the NADSAT slang for money. This has nothing to do with the rest of the lyrics of The Cutter, but it's something that kind of startled me when I finally belatedly realized it long after that song had come and gone. And what's the label that they were on when they recorded that? They were on a label called Korova, which is the name of the bar where the first scene of A Clockwork Orange takes place in both the book and the movie. So, nothing to do with anything. I'm just stalling for time here. Like this isn't going to be long enough. What's next? The next one is Wings versus ELO. Really no contest there. I'm absolutely not an ELO fan, so Sir Paulie gets it. Here's Red Rose Speedway, my old original copy with the naughty booklet that they didn't even reproduce when they did deluxe reissues of that, because I think they thought twice about some of the ladies who appear without a lot of clothes on in the booklet. Next up is Smiths versus Joy Division. Another one where I don't have much of an opinion. I used to have all the main Joy Division albums. I don't have them anymore, so that tells you what it needs to tell you. I've never owned a Smiths album. The Smiths probably have better songs, but I can't really give an opinion on those two. Lou Reed versus Iggy Pop, and the winner is David Bowie. Because my favorite Lou Reed, one of the few that I've ever owned, is Transformer. And the only Iggy Pop album I've ever owned is The Idiot, which is from the period when he was working with David Bowie. Lou Reed's Transformer is really interesting as the subject of one of those behind the music documentaries, where my favorite parts of those documentaries is when they go into the studio with the multi-track masters and they solo various parts of the song. And they do this while they're interspersing it with Lou Reed, because they've got him himself appearing in the documentary, playing acoustic versions of the songs, and he's just strumming random chords while warbling tuneless versions of the songs. He doesn't seem to have any idea how they go. And meanwhile, they're going into the studio and soloing David Bowie's backing vocals, and you realize it's 3 layers of harmony from David Bowie that make this listenable. So I think David was behind what's good about both of those. So there we go. Okay, the next match is Van Morrison versus Elton John. Now, I'm not an Enophile. I mean, I love Eno, but I'm not an Enophile, a wine expert. But I just like the metaphor of Van Morrison would be like a very fine vintage wine that has aged to perfection and has roots in the past when it was first bottled, but has developed in such a way that could never be duplicated by any other wine, and that has its own depth and complexity. That's Van Morrison. And Elton John is like a bottle of Coca-Cola. So there's nothing wrong with a bottle of Coca-Cola, but there's no question that Van Morrison wins this one. And we go from there to number 11 is Bob Dylan versus Neil Young. And I have to say, is this a joke? Bob Dylan versus Neil Young. Bob Dylan is a cornerstone of modern music. He is one of the towering figures of popular music in the latter half of the 20th century on into the present day. And Neil Young is a very good singer-songwriter. Bob Dylan, without a question. Okay, the next is Blondie versus the Pretenders. This is tricky. Absolutely, if I want to reach for a good, catchy pop record, I'm more likely to go for a Blondie album. I think Blondie has a lot more songs that I love. The music is just really enjoyable, fun, and sly. There's often a sting in the tale, a bit of campiness, a knowing wink. The Pretenders are more earnest, more balls out, you might say, and Chrissie Hynde would probably be the first to acknowledge that. Blondie is going to be my choice, although really the number one song, I mean, it's hard for a Blondie song to really hook me in the heart the way my favorite Pretenders song, which would be Time the Avenger, does. That's one that really destroys me. So Blondie's the one I'm going to show. Just a great band, great singing in a, as I say, a kind of sly way. Great drumming. Clem Burke is a really overlooked or underrated, maybe both, drummer. Great drummer in the Pretenders too. Martin Chambers. Really, Clem Burke is like Keith Moon, and Martin Chambers is like John Bonham. So, not being a big Led Zeppelin fan, ooh, spoiler alert, I'm going to go with the Blondie folks. But here's a Pretenders single, just so they won't feel left out. Sorry, Chrissy. Didn't want you to feel bad about this. I know you're watching this. Next up is David Bowie versus Prince. I think that's a bizarre pairing. Apparently, Robert did say that they're associated because they both died in 2016. That awful year when we lost so many music greats, like 2/3 of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and 2 of the original Jefferson Airplane members, and George Martin, and many more. That was like the anno horribilis. And then 2020 comes along and says, hold my beer. For me, there's no question that it's David Bowie. Prince is great. Prince is a genius. I've just never, was a genius, I'm sorry. Just never really dug very deeply into his catalog. In fact, at the time he died, I didn't even own any of his records. I had owned at least a single or so, but I'd been meaning to pick up, in particular, Around the World in a Day and Sign of the Times, but I hadn't gotten around to it when all of a sudden the awful news came along. He was gone, and of course at that time you couldn't get his records for love or money because they all disappeared from the outlets, but I did get those not too long after. So I'm not princeless. Someday, I knew my prince would come. Next up is Blur versus Oasis. Who? Okay, next up is Pink Floyd versus Led Zeppelin. Yeah, I spoiled this one. Not a big Zeppelin fan, so absolutely am a big Pink Floyd fan, particularly of the period between the Sid years and the Roger Waters concept album years. So here's a single from that era, a couple of songs from their More soundtrack. And we move on to Bruce Springsteen versus Tom Petty. Pass. And then XTC versus The Jam. That's hard, not because I don't know my choice. I know my choice very well, but I really hate to leave out The Jam because I think The Jam is a terrific band. They are a bit, there is a bit like the earlier matching of the Byrds versus the Doors, in that I hear the Jam as being very consistent sounding, even though they did change quite a bit, particularly at the end when they brought in the brass to their music, and that really gave them an added dimension. But XTC is just a much more colorful band, I think. In more than one way. So I'm going with XTC. This is not a cassette. This is a CD package of the Oranges and Lemons album on 3 3-inch CDs. Perfectly normal. Okay, Paul Simon versus Joni Mitchell. Well, if we're considering Paul Simon strictly as a solo artist, then it's an easy choice, Joni Mitchell. If we're including Simon and Garfunkel, it's a little bit closer, but it's still Joni. So, I'm going to show Joni. Her Hissing of Summer Lawns is my very favorite in her catalog. Wonderful album. Next up is Fleetwood Mac versus Queen. I don't have a strong opinion about Fleetwood Mac. They're okay. I'm not a big fan of Queen either. I'm going with Queen. More interested in them in general. Fleetwood Mac, it's a strange pairing because Fleetwood Mac is kind of more than one band. It really feels like the Peter Green era and the Buckingham and Nicks era were two completely different bands. And in between, the group with Bob Welch, I don't know if that was a transition or a third band entirely, or just neither fish nor fowl. But I'll go with Queen. And finally, Elvis Costello versus the Police. Very easy choice. Going with Elvis. Saw Shannon D., who made the opposite choice, disparage Elvis a bit for being clever. And he is, actually, she didn't use these words, but I think that what she's hearing is that he's clever. He's arch. To me, that's part of what makes him great. I love that. As a child, the music I heard around the home was mostly Broadway show tunes and arch lyrics with a lot of wordplay, a lot of elaborate rhyming. That's a feature that I really loved from early on. And that's something that's really prominent in Elvis Costello's lyrics. Musically, I think he's just great. Always loved his stuff. Police, just never had much interest. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I don't know if my subscriber count is going to plummet after this, but we'll see. Be well. Talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.